Why is China declining so rapidly? It's been going at such a fast pace that it's absolutely unbelievable. So stick around in this video and I'll explain to you why the Chinese have been in a state of decline over the past few months and what this may mean in terms of, I guess you could say, the global stage. And so starting off what's been happening recently and then working back from there and showing why people are a little bit concerned about this. Recently in China, there's been a massive housing market crash. Think the 2008 economic recession here in the United States with the balloon mortgages, but on a totally different level. You see, because in China, the normal thing for people to do with their savings was to buy real estate. Much like you go and buy stocks in the United States or futures or shorts or something similar, people in China went and bought apartments or houses. The Chinese have a massive housing market. Well, at least before we're talking about right now. Right now they don't, but beforehand they did. And a lot of what the Chinese people would do is that if they lived in a house and they were wanting to save their money or maybe invest in something, they would go buy another house or they would go buy an apartment. And so people started to go into a frenzy in this kind of, I guess you could say, investment. In fact, they were investing so much into housing that most of the time these people were buying apartments before the building had even broken ground. And so, after a while of this kind of rapid speed of trying to buy up as much housing as possible, the entire Chinese housing market collapsed in on itself, and a lot of people who had spent, well, in China, billions of dollars on future houses that were supposed to be potential investments for these people, they're never going to be built, and the companies that got the money from these people, they're not giving it back. And so the Chinese public freaked out. And they went into riots and protests over the housing market crash, demanding that the government does something about it. And the government decided, yeah, right now is a good time to do something about it, but it's about you people. And so they brought out the military, they brought out the police, and they started putting down these protesters and rioters who had pretty much lost their shirts in the investments that they made. And so the Chinese started to have a little bit of a rough time because of this. And we can also see that loads of articles were written about this Chinese housing crisis when it happened. I cannot get on these links, and I cannot talk about this in great detail because they show pictures and videos of some of the things that were happening during that time. And due to how YouTube is currently operating with China and what's going on there, I don't want to show it because they will have recourse to probably age restrict this so no one can see it. So sadly, I can't really go into it too much, but if you do want to see it, just type in Chinese housing market crash, and there are a million articles made by some of the largest news companies out there about what happened. Anyways, the situation was getting pretty bad, and while the military was cracking people's heads open like some kind of scrambled egg, at the same time, the Chinese were trying to find another way to put this thing down, and what better way than COVID. So what they said is that another COVID wave was coming through, and they shut everyone inside of their buildings. The best way for the Chinese to do this, they decided, was to actually either weld the doors shut or to put a piece of rebar in the ground in front of the direction of the doors opening, where no one could really open up the door at all unless if a government official came by or a crew came by with some kind of a grinder and cut that rebar off the floor. And so people became stuck in their apartments again, much like they had been during the first phase of COVID. But then there was something even worse that happened that had been completely overlooked until it boiled over and Apple saw that they may not be getting any iPhones for the near future. A lot of workers at the factories that work to produce goods like iPhones had to end up continuing to work because the Chinese care about their people, unless if it gets in the way of the bottom line, and then they need to keep on working. And so they decided that to make sure the COVID policies were best implemented, that they would keep the factory workers at the factories 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without break. They would be fed, they would be kept in incredibly poor conditions, but as long as those assembly lines kept running and kept producing those sweet, sweet phones, so that way the Chinese government could continue to make a killing off of US trade, which we can see right here, we actually end up having nearly a $400 billion trade deficit with the Chinese every year, which means that they get about $400 billion of economic growth worth per year out of the United States. And they're not going to sacrifice that, because while a lot of people think that the US is reliant on the Chinese for their trade and that the Chinese can cut us off and we'll suffer, the truth is that all of the money in this transaction is going to the Chinese. And so they would actually end up being the one that would suffer the most instead of the United States. The United States would just buy the goods from somewhere else. The Chinese would have to figure out people who would buy the goods. And considering that the US wouldn't be buying them anymore, they would be in quite the pickle. So that is a massive deal to the Chinese. And so they decided, while we're going to crush the dissidents, we're going to make sure that they keep on making the iPhones. And so they did, and they lived in terrible conditions for about a month. However, something happened that the Chinese Communist Party just couldn't predict. In a town in China, not getting into specific names, specific dates, or anything like that, an apartment building caught on fire, and it began to burn down. People flocked from all over, the firefighters did, to try and put out the fire, but the problem was that they couldn't get in the building to get the people out, and the people couldn't get out of the building because they were locked in, pretty much, by the concrete rebar, the iron rebar in the concrete in the ground. And so 3 kids that had been left home by their parents who were working in one of the factories ended up burning alive because of the Chinese trying to crush dissidents, pretty much, and using COVID as an excuse. And so this outraged the Chinese public that this had happened to these 3 kids. And the Chinese government's response was the most heartfelt response, probably it's a sign of a really caring government. They said that these 3 kids should not have died, and if only they had practiced better survival skills and better survival training, maybe they would have survived the fire. But it's by no fault the Chinese government. Those stupid kids ought to have known better than to burn alive in a building. And so you can see that by the compassion of the Chinese government and how they had reacted to this terrible situation and already the boiling over tensions in China, that things were going to go quite well. And they didn't. The Chinese immediately went into massive riots and protests in the street, calling for the denouncement of Xi Jinping as well as the entirety of the Chinese Communist Party. And things started to go incredibly bad. Not only that, but these protesters finally joined the protesters that are in Hong Kong and still going on in a way, although they've been put down a whole load. And we can actually see another article from the Congressional Research Service, which is an incredible research service. You can find really an article on anything in a very short summarized summary, but it talks about what happened in Hong Kong in 2020 that led to the protests and riots that are still going on to this day there. And so not only are the Chinese having to put down protests and riots in an incredibly profitable special economic region, which you can see right there, the HKSAR stands for the Hong Kong Special Economic Region, they're also having to deal with massive riots and protests inside of mainland China itself, which makes it a great deal of money. In fact, it wasn't just the citizens themselves that were living in these apartment blocks that rose up. Remember the factory workers I was talking about a little while ago? Well, they decided to rise up against their terrible working conditions at the exact same time, mostly for the same reasons that they were being treated poorly by the government. And so the government tried to put down the factory workers by violent means. They really didn't succeed, it just continued on. It's just that things got a little bit more bloody. And they tried to quell the general masses as best they could, but that didn't really work well either. And so finally, the Chinese have shown a true sign of compassion, mostly because they're scared that if they try and continue to put their thumb down on the entirety of the Chinese population, it could explode. This is not Tiananmen Square, where it was just Beijing. This is the entirety of China, including the Special Economic Region of Hong Kong, which adds in a great deal, which we'll get to later. So finally, they've decided that the best thing to do is probably to backtrack and ease the COVID policies that just came in just weeks ago to put down the dissidents, so that way they don't sit there and start to call for blood, because if they call for blood, then things are really going to start falling apart really quickly in China, while right now they're falling apart slow enough that the government at least can try and do some things in an emergency setting to try and quell it. So that's the current situation we're seeing right now in China, is that things look like they may be simmering down a little bit, but now that the Chinese have given these protesters an inch, they may start demanding for a mile. That's usually how things go, and if you look at the French Revolution, which is a pretty good example of what's happening here right now with the poor conditions that the Chinese are currently living in, French peasants were also living in an equally poor condition. And once the French government gave in to the demands of these protesters, they gave them an inch and they went for a mile, and at the end of it, the French, I guess you could say the Bourbon dynasty that had ruled France for so long died, and the French Republic came into being. This is kind of going down a similar route right now. But speaking of all of this, and speaking about what's going on over there, what does that really have to do with the West? What does that really impact us directly? Well, earlier on in the year, the Chinese were getting in some very tense standoffs with the Taiwanese in the Taiwan Strait. In case of y'all don't know, and we're going to be referring to them like this from here forward in the video, China is not actually China, it's the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan's official name is the Republic of China. This dates all the way back to the pretty much right after the Second World War, and if you're interested in that, if this video hits 3,000, 4,000 likes, Well, we'll go with 4,000. Go big or go home. If it reaches 4,000 likes, I'll make a video on the Chinese Civil War and explain what happened there and why this has led to the situation in the modern day. But the People's Republic of China claims that they own all of China and that the Republic of China is a part of them and they should be and they will take that by force. And the Republic of China says that they are the true China and they control what is really the People's Republic of China these days and that it ought to be theirs. And so both sides have hated each other for a pretty long while, about 70 years at this point, and that almost came to a boiling point earlier this year when the invasion of Ukraine started. It looked like China was also going to begin a war with Taiwan. This is incredibly important to the West because TSMC, the largest producer of semiconductors anywhere in the world of most kinds, is inside of Taiwan, and while they're building a facility in the United States, it'll be about 2 whole years until that facility ever produces its first semiconductor. And so Taiwan is strategically and economically important for that reason to the West, because if the Chinese gain control of it, the Chinese gain control of pretty much the entire technological sector in the West, which means that they can inadvertently or directly control our economy by either producing more semiconductors or making them a lot more expensive to foreign markets while making them incredibly cheap for them, which turns the entire economic situation around almost overnight. So these two things tie into each other because now that the Chinese are having massive woes domestically, usually the common move is that to distract the public in a country from what's going on internally, they focus the anger externally. And so the fear is that now, due to everything that's happened in China and how rapidly the situation is decaying there, that they may attempt to either crush the rights of the citizens of Hong Kong and absorb the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region into just being a special economic or administrative region like the rest of the major cities are in China, like Shanghai, or they may attempt to invade Taiwan, because that will end up pretty beneficial for them in 2 ways. Not only will they be directing people's attention domestically abroad, they'll also be hopefully gaining TSMC as a strategic resource that they can control world economies and their domestic economy with further on. And so for all of these reasons, everything looks like it's starting to get very hairy in China, and we're wondering how the Chinese will deal with this. They can survive it. There's no question at all that they can attempt to survive this by pulling out some real emergency measures, but what kind of extremes are they going to be going to try and put these situations back under control? And considering the history of the People's Republic of China and what they've done, the decisions are limitless, to say the least, and we really have no idea what they'll be doing in the next following days, but that's what's been happening up until now, and that's what we're working with at the moment. And I thank you all so much once again for watching. If y'all did enjoy this little video summary, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and also comment as well. And if you have any additional information you would like to add, because I can't cover everything in these videos. I think at this point it's probably about 10 minutes long, but you know, this could go on for hours, and there's a whole bunch of extra detail that I can't cover. And so if there's anything you would like to have known, put it down in the comment section below and let people know about it. If you would like me to know something that you think I may not know, also put that down there, because I always like to learn a little bit more, because I don't know everything. But this is about all I know right now. And so I thank you all so much once again for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care, see you around.